Welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. The only true crime podcast made for uninterrupted nighttime listening. Real-life mysteries, told more mindfully. We have a few new followers, so I'm going to reintroduce myself. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator and host of Dead Sleep, and I'm a longtime journalist. And I've hosted a few other podcasts, some for HBO Max, in the true crime genre. But Dead Sleep is my own independent passion project. Something I made for people like me. Overthinkers who want a brain puzzle before bed. A well-researched, creatively told true crime tale that's gripping and never graphic. Dead Sleep is listener supported. If you can afford $5 a month, we appreciate it. And if you can't, it's okay. Life is short, and it's complicated, and it can be stressful. So please let this show be a sanctuary for your subconscious as we venture into a different world, a peaceful world. One of the most beautiful and peaceful places in the world. The stunning, verdant coastline of central Maine. If you've never been to Maine, it's famous for a few things. Maine is famous for its lighthouses, for its lobster, for its people who are extremely direct, zero BS, and they even have their own unique slang. When something is very good, it's wicked good. And one of the most wicked good things about Maine, what the state is most famous for and synonymous with, is LL Bean. What Coco Chanel is to Paris fashion and haute couture, LL Bean is to rugged New England life. An iconic figure, a real person who represented the preppy aesthetic. Clothes, socks, backpacks, anoraks, made for lives lived in nature, to go boating in, go hiking in, and trudging through the snow. I grew up in Connecticut and went to school in Western Mass. And back then, everybody had a pair of LL Bean duck boots. It was the only way to get through the icy cold winters. LL Bean, of course, was famous for its catalogs, actual printed catalogs that would arrive in the mail, and that some people, including me, enjoyed as relaxation, even reading it as a sleep aid. And maybe I'll do a bonus episode reading something from the LL Bean catalog because it is extremely relaxing. It's wicked relaxing. And the family of LL Bean, one member of that sprawling, famous family, is featured in tonight's story. A very rich and very powerful older woman who really just wanted some peace and quiet, but instead found herself at the center of a conspiracy. A sinister plot that led to a series of uniquely shocking deaths. This is Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, and a slow crime story with an unusual type of victim. This is Doom with a View. There are approximately 17 million acres of forest land in Maine. That figure is so hard to imagine. Maybe it's better if I put it this way. Roughly 90% of Maine is forested. That's the highest percentage of any state, according to the U.S. Forest Service. So with all of that forest, you wouldn't think anyone would notice a couple of dying trees. But Lisa Gorman did. Lisa Gorman is the wife, now widow, of Leon Gorman. And Leon Gorman was the grandson of the founder of LL Bean. That's Leon Wood Bean. He is really the LL in LL Bean. Now, grandson Leon Gorman ran the company for decades, and he's largely credited with making LL Bean a hugely successful and enduring brand. Leon died of cancer in 2015 at the age of 80. And since his passing in 2015, his wife, Lisa, now in her early 70s, has carried on her husband's memory as a philanthropist and conservationist. She's a generous provider of local college scholarships and donates vast sums to protect Maine's coastline, which is a long way of saying that whether it's people or trees, Lisa Gorman is all about ensuring things grow and thrive. So Lisa, she noticed when something was wrong with a pair of northern red oak trees behind her house. It was April 2022, and Lisa Gorman was studying the oak trees in her backyard with great concern. When I say backyard, it's more like woods. The area around her house and all of the nearby houses were densely wooded with all kinds of trees: dogwood, American beech, black maple. But the red oak, well, those oak trees in Maine, they were special. They were native to the area, born from a single acorn and capable of growing several stories high. And some of those oak trees, they were hundreds of years old. Some of the oak trees around that property were likely from the 1600s or even before. And needless to say, they've seen some stuff. When I said earlier that life is short, that's for humans. For trees, life is very long, or at least it should be. The trees, they looked like they'd gone bald. In photos of Lisa's vast property from around that time, you can see her big house, surrounded by trees, right there on the water. And then just behind her was a line of tall oaks. And in that photo, which was taken from a distance as if from a drone, you can see it right there. These tall, majestic trees that were as scrawny and lifeless as scarecrows. They clearly looked sick. What was Lisa going to do? If it sounds like Lisa Gorman was treating these trees almost like people, you're not wrong. Because trees are more like us than we realize. Trees don't have thoughts and feelings, but recent research reveals that trees do have a form of sentience, a sense of being, a consciousness, all their own. In a best-selling book by a German author named Peter Wohlleben, this book was published a few years ago, and it's called The Hidden Life of Trees. Peter Wohlleben, who is a forestry expert, suggested that trees are complex and interconnected, that they feel or sense things like danger. And what's more, they are capable of communicating with other trees through their deep network of roots. One way to think about it is like trees have neural pathways, like rudimentary versions of what humans have. And they are able to use their roots to communicate with each other. I picture like a deep underground group chat where trees text each other things like, "I'm thirsty, send some water down this way." Now, this is Peter Wohleben's theory, and when I read the book, The Hidden Life of Trees, I thought this sounded absolutely bananas. And maybe his perspective is a little romantic, but one thing is for sure. Trees do communicate. When they're healthy, they're sturdy with robust foliage. And when they're unhealthy As Lisa could clearly see with these two oaks, they communicated they were sick, that something bad was happening, that they were dying, and that someone was trying to kill them. All of that was painfully obvious to Lisa. But what they couldn't tell her, and what she needed to know, was who or what was behind all this. Lisa had no idea what was wrong, but soon a possible suspect emerged. A group of them, actually. The suspects were foreign, brown, hairy, and vicious. They were brown-tail moth larvae, thick, prickly caterpillars. And in recent years, in that area of Maine, these caterpillars were everywhere. The brown-tail moth caterpillars often emerged in April, gorging themselves on the very best trees, apple, cherry, and oak. A gang of these caterpillars could munch away on a tree until there was nothing left but a skeleton of branches. Now, Lisa Gorman was a conservationist, and she likely knew that Maine had a lot of rules around getting rid of pests like brown-tail moth larvae. Pesticides were carefully controlled in Maine to protect the forest and the coastal areas. But the thing was, Lisa had already been careful. Brown-tail moth caterpillars hurt humans too. If you touch one, you can get a nasty rash. So she knew prevention was the best cure, which meant she was confident. She'd taken care of brown-tail moth caterpillars without having to use any pesticide. And she knew she didn't have a problem with any caterpillars on her trees. But still, these trees were sick, and they looked like they were dying. So what could it be? By June of 2022, the oak trees were enough of a problem that one of Lisa's neighbors came down to talk to Lisa about the sick trees and to offer her help. The woman's name was Amelia Bond. Amelia and Lisa, they had a lot in common. They were both successful multimillionaires. Amelia was a successful investment banker who married Arthur Bond III, an architect. Amelia and Art, her husband, were from St. Louis, Missouri, and they were prominent members of the community in St. Louis. Arthur's uncle was Kit Bond, who was once the governor of Missouri and later a Republican senator representing the state. Amelia, like Lisa, was a well-known philanthropist, and after her career in finance, she decided to give back to her community by becoming the CEO of the St. Louis Foundation, a nonprofit with a reported $500 million in assets. It made sense that someone as successful and important as Amelia Bond and her husband Art would want a summer refuge. She and her husband could have chosen anywhere for their rustic retreat, like the Ozark Mountains, which are located in Missouri. But instead, they chose Maine. Camden, Maine. Camden, Maine is a town of a few thousand people, and it's a mix of year-round regulars, those are locals who grew up in the area, and the other people, the people who come from away. People who came for the summer, usually wealthy and important people like Amelia and Arthur Bond. Art Bond's firm was behind some of the most high-profile civic projects in St. Louis, from building libraries to schools to children's playgrounds. So Amelia was a CEO with a vision, and Art, he was the creative who had the aesthetics. And together, they were going to make their new summer home a 4-bedroom, 5-bathroom, 4,000-square-foot mansion, purchased in 2018 for $1.8 million. This place, was going to be their boomer paradise. Which was why in June of 2022, Amelia came to see Lisa. Amelia and Art's home was just behind Lisa's. And from their home, they could see those poor, dying oak trees. And Amelia was concerned about them. Amelia, being the powerhouse CEO that she was, she came with a plan. Let's put these oak trees out of their misery. Let's cut them down. It was really their only option. Lisa wasn't sure what it was, and Amelia, being from Missouri, didn't have a huge amount of experience with Maine issues in nature. But she did make an offer. Generous offer. We can share the costs of cutting the trees down. Lisa appreciated the gesture, but she wasn't interested. She had her own team of experts, arborists, and landscapers who might be able to help her diagnose the problem. For Lisa, these trees were like loved ones, like family. She wanted to find out what was wrong with these trees and whether or not she could save them. And the answer couldn't come soon enough, because during that summer of 2022, things got even worse. Lisa was worried about more than just a couple of trees. It was as if her entire property had some kind of virus. The dogwood trees looked ill. The grass looked sickly. Everything seemed to be turning brown and dying, like there was some terrible disease. What was happening? Lisa, Amelia, and Art were all members of the same local yacht club, an exclusive club with just around 300 members, where everyone pretty much knew everybody, the locals and the people from away. Was anyone else experiencing any other kind of plants that were getting sick? Amelia and Art, they had to be worried about their property too. If what was happening to Lisa's trees was going to happen to the Bond's trees, would cutting these trees down even make a difference? Lisa was a wealthy woman with a fleet of gardeners and specialists who could help her determine what was wrong with her trees and surrounding property. When the local experts examined the trees and the area, they weren't sure what was going on. There was some type of poison. But what kind and where it came from, it was nothing they recognized. The only way that Lisa was going to be able to find out what was going to happen with these trees was by running some tests. So she sent some soil samples taken from around the tree and other parts of the property. And those samples were sent all the way across the country to a lab in Oregon, the only lab specialized enough to be able to determine what exactly was killing her trees. Was what was happening natural or chemical? Mother Nature or man-made? Had she discovered some type of mutation? Or was this more like attempted murder? There are 14 Superfund sites in Maine. That word, Superfund, it sounds like it would be good, but it's not. Superfund sites are locations designated by the Environmental Protection Agency as locations polluted, seriously, irrevocably polluted by hazardous materials. And one of the missions of designating Superfund sites is to hold companies that pollute, holding them accountable for that cleanup, so that Americans can have safe drinking water and clean air, two things which are, or should be, a basic, fundamental human right. Maine, like a lot of other states in this country, had spent the last several decades attempting to clean up these sites. So maybe that was what was going on here. Was there something in the water, in the soil, from a distant Superfund site, one of the 14 in Maine, that somehow had made its way to that coastal area in Maine? And it just so happened that Lisa Gorman was the first who was able to see it, identify it, and test it. Lisa wouldn't know. Nobody would, until the test came back. And all they could really do that summer of 2022 was wait and hope that she could keep these innocent trees, that she could save them and keep them alive. Lisa Gorman and her now deceased husband, Leon, had enjoyed Camden, Maine as their summer destination for 20 years. And if you were lucky enough to be a guest in the Gormans' stunning home, you would have seen a picture-perfect view of the harbor. Little kids making sandcastles at the local beach, giggling as they ran from the gentle ocean waves that rolled onto the shore. You would see the sailboats and schooners gliding along the Penobscot Bay. At the yacht club, there'd be lobster bakes, fresh corn on the cob. It was like a life straight out of the L.L. Bean catalog. But it was even better because it was real. That picture-perfect view was shattered in the summer of 2022, when Lisa's tranquil retreat was under threat. All of her plants, trees, flowers, at risk from some mystery toxin. Time passed. Summer turned to autumn, the leaves turning their brilliant colors of yellow, orange, vermilion, and dropping, as they were supposed to, in a brilliant final farewell before winter. In November of 2022, roughly 7 months since she first noticed her dying oak trees, the test results from those soil samples came back. And at long last, Lisa could determine what was wrong, so she could fix it. She could save her trees. When the results came back, the answer was shocking, devastating, and diabolical. The soil samples revealed those trees were poisoned by a potent chemical called tebuthyron. What was tebuthyron? It was an herbicide, which means that it didn't come from some Superfund site, but was applied somewhere closer to home. In an amount so toxic, it was likely poured directly onto the oak trees themselves. The strange thing was, tebuthyron wasn't an herbicide used in Maine. This particular chemical compound came from away. Tebuthyron is defined as a broad-spectrum herbicide that is used to control weeds in non-cropland areas, which means rangelands, rights-of-way, and industrial sites. In grasslands, it's used to control woody and herbaceous plants and weeds, such as alfalfa, bluegrasses, chickweed, and clover. It is not approved for use in EU countries, but it is registered for use in the U.S. in large, vast, flat, grassy areas, which was not the rocky, forested landscape of Maine. Tebuthyron was widely used in the Midwestern states, like Kansas, Michigan, in Missouri. In fact, you can buy a 5-pound bag of Tebutyron at just about any local hardware store in St. Louis, Missouri for around $100, which is exactly what Amelia Bond did. How exactly it all went down, how or why Amelia decided to poison Lisa's trees, this would take a little time to unstrand. But it wasn't a huge surprise to Lisa Gorman, because she suspected something was off when they moved in. When they discovered there was a misapprehension that those oak trees, the ones that were on Lisa's property, it appeared that Amelia and Art Bond thought those were their trees. At least that's what they claimed one time when Lisa learned that they were trying to chainsaw those trees. In fact, one really specific incident where they were trying to cut down the trees and Lisa and her gardeners had to get in the way to stop them. But had her neighbors really resorted to poisoning her trees and then act like it hadn't happened? What kind of person would do that? And why? Sure, they were trees, but it really was like trying to solve a murder case. How and when did they do it? And was it premeditated? Now, in Lisa's mind, this whole thing started in April of 2022 when she noticed her sickly trees. But in fact, this whole thing, it started much earlier, roughly a year earlier. She learned the plot to kill her trees was indeed premeditated. All just one part of a sinister and secret plan made by two people who wanted something, and they weren't going to let anything stand in their way. There's an expression, an aphorism, and it goes something like, "Can't see the forest for the trees." That expression, when someone can't see the forest through the trees, it means that this person is so mired in the minutia, in the details of something, that they can't see the big picture. That expression, by the way, forest through the trees, it dates all the way back to the 1500s, an English poet, of course, who understood that taking a step back and being able to look at the big picture, that was a sign of wisdom, of magnanimity, of generosity, and could give a person a sense of fairness beyond what their own interests are. For Amelia, this was both an apt metaphor and the source of her ire. And the irony of this would be really funny if this wasn't such a total disaster. She and her husband moved to Maine, a state that is 90% forested. Yet when she got there, all she could see were these goddamn trees, blocking their view of the harbor. I'm not entirely sure why or how they didn't notice this when they saw the home, but when Amelia and Arthur Bond moved into their summer home, at some point, they went out to take in the incredible harbor view. Except instead, they were confronted by these oak trees and their robust, shiny, green leaves. At some point, they decided that those trees, they had to go. Around that time, Arthur started trimming the trees, taking off the tops of those oaks so they could get a better view. And when Lisa found out about that, she freaked out and was really unhappy. Those were her oak trees. Do not touch. Now, in the mind of Amelia and Arthur, maybe Lisa was being unfair. A not-in-my-backyard NIMBY who was being selfish. You could cut a tree and trim it back, and it would be alive and healthy. But that wasn't going to happen, so they had to move on to Plan B, which meant Amelia Bond bringing a bag of herbicide from St. Louis to Maine and trespassing onto Lisa's property and sprinkling that deadly herbicide onto those trees. So they essentially confessed, but what kind of crime was this? What kind of punishment should someone get for poisoning a couple of trees? Well, there was a precedent. Several years earlier, a sports fan, a football fan in Alabama, poisoned a majestic old oak tree, a legendary oak tree that belonged to a rival football team. He used the same exact herbicide and killed that tree. He was a lone operator, and when he was caught, he actually got in big trouble and served some jail time. Would that be the fate of Amelia Bond? Local officials admitted they didn't quite know what to do. The seriousness of the case was something they hadn't really seen before. On top of that, Amelia was underhanded, because not only has she poisoned the trees in 2021, when the poison took effect in April of 2022, she pretended to not know anything about it and offered to help with the cost of cutting down those poor sick trees, even though she was the one who made them sick in the first place. Understanding how tebuthyron works is important to understand how the trees died. Tebuthyron suppresses photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is how plants essentially take in sunlight, carbon dioxide, that's CO2 from the air, and H2O, usually water from soil. And photosynthesis converts those elements into two things, oxygen and glucose, aka sugar. The oxygen goes out into the air, and that helps us, and the glucose, the sugar, fortifies the plant. Well, this herbicide, it inhibits photosynthesis. So they basically turned those trees into zombies. And the only way they could turn back, maybe, is if the herbicide broke down or was flushed out. The problem in this case was that particular herbicide, tebuthyron, it never breaks down. And the potency of that poison in those trees and the vegetation around them, it was unlikely that if it leached into those roots that it would be flushed out. Ultimately, the Bonds did get what they wanted. Those trees had to be removed. They were cut down. And that meant they had the perfect view of the bay. The painful paradox was, of course, to enjoy that perfect view of nature. They destroyed nature itself. That herbicide, it leached into everything. And over time, authorities discovered that it didn't just threaten Lisa's home and her property and her flowers and trees. There were significant amounts of this herbicide found along that public beach where little kids played and made sandcastles and ran around in the water. It found its way into the bay, where aquatic life that was around the bay also tested positive with this herbicide. It's incredible how just a 4-pound bag of poison could affect thousands of people. That's pretty dark. But was it criminal? It turns out in Maine, her punishment would be a fine. And at that time, the maximum fine was around $4,500. And when word got out that that was her punishment, a fine of $4,500, which is pocket change for someone like Amelia Bond, so people were upset because it was like the bad guy won. And in a way, that was true, because the state of Maine had never seen the scope of this type of environmental hazardous destruction before, not by one individual. And so they just didn't even have the laws and penalties to apply to this kind of destruction. And I have to believe Amelia Bond herself hadn't planned it out that way. But that's what happened. And honestly, if this had happened to anyone else but the widow of the L.L. Bean scion, that might have been it. But Lisa Gorman, she wasn't done with the Bonds. She needed to make them pay. She sued them for a stunning amount of money to cover the costs of years, possibly decades, generations of that herbicide being on her property, and the care and maintenance of making sure that that herbicide didn't hurt anyone or any of her wildlife or plants. And she used her clout to ensure that this particular incident and that this case received broad attention. Ultimately, the Bonds and Lisa Gorman, they settled for an amount that is almost exactly equal to the cost of their house, $1.8 million. But it isn't over yet. This past month, in June of 2024, the Attorney General of Maine said they were looking into this case. And it's possible that the Bonds, Amelia Bond, will be on the hook for thousands, even millions of dollars more. There's a bedtime story. You might remember it. It's called The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. And it was actually a bedtime story I didn't like very much because it made me feel sad. In that bedtime story, it's about an apple tree and a little boy. And over time, the boy grows up. And with each stage of his life, the tree, she gives. Beginning, it's an apple. When he wants to build a house, she offers the wood. And by the end of the book, and this is the part I never liked, he uses every single part of her, that the tree gives everything, down to the stump that he sits on as an old man. And with these oak trees, it's a similar feeling. That even in the end, these trees, they give something back. Because of what happened with these poison trees, the state of Maine is going to change legislation and change some of their laws and policies so that there are stiffer penalties for people who show a reckless and disturbing lack of regard for the preciousness of nature and our responsibility to protect it, or at the very least, leave it alone. And with that comes a broader understanding that there's a connection between the way we treat the natural world and the way we treat each other. Many people were really upset that Amelia Bond likely won't go to jail, and that she's so wealthy that maybe those fines and penalties, they'll pinch, but they won't really make a dent or make a difference. But for wealthy, powerful people, especially those who pride themselves on their good works and philanthropy, there's another form of punishment. It's almost worse than being behind bars. Amelia and her husband, they're social outcasts. And they still have that summer home, apparently. But they no longer belong to the yacht club. And they're known in that area and in that state and in this country and even around the world because this story blew up just a couple of weeks ago in June of 2024. They'll be known for being tree killers. And that's a pretty sad and pathetic thing to be. Throughout American history, some of our greatest poets, some of our most important philosophers, they too were social outcasts. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. And when society cast them out, they found solace in the woods, in nature, in the peace and the sanctity and challenges of those very same New England woods. But Amelia Bond, because of what she did, she won't even have that. Because if that German forest expert is correct, that trees can feel, and that they can feel danger, and that they have a rudimentary awareness, and that they can communicate with each other, those underground group chats through their roots, if that is in any way true, I imagine that if Amelia Bond tried to walk into a forest right about now, the group chat would be something like, "Oh, there she is, the tree killer. Everybody, keep your distance. And I know we usually give and give and give as trees, but for this one, don't give her a leaf. Don't drop a single apple. Don't afford her a sliver of shade. Don't offer a steady branch. Don't even let her rest against her tree trunk. Because she's the woman who said she wanted paradise, but ended up in no man's land." Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back next week with an all-new true crime story. Until then, nighty-night.